Okay. Okay, everybody, can you see my screen? It's there. All right. So let's talk through what I mean by the Human Subjects Bootcamp and what this really means to all of you. I mean, the idea, obviously, is that you are all undertaking your capstone research and you want to do some data collection. We know that evidence and data are important to the capstone process. Just to, you probably remember this from 490, the 490 class. In order to answer your research question, you need to assemble evidence. That evidence comes from multiple sources. As you get into your internship, you will have your own personal experience. You will make observations. There will be anecdotes that stem from your interactions with your site supervisor and faculty advisor, conversations you have with them as well. So that's all coming from your capstone experience. You'll also have the published literature, or even the popular media, blogs, websites, lots of different sources of information that you should be drawing on as well. And those are all good things. But to make the capstone a bit more rigorous, we also, I wouldn't say require, but I strongly encourage students to collect their own data, or at least analyze their own data in one or another way. If this is blurry to you, I apologize. It probably has to do with your bandwidth. Might have to do with my bandwidth. Can you all see it okay? Is it coming through relatively clearly? It's always hard to know. Okay, yeah. I mean, it's usually bandwidth issues. One of the nice things about recording is it's recording at my internal speed, so the recording should be clear regardless. Okay, so yeah, so evidence. In terms of data, there's lots of different types of data out there, but today specifically we're going to talk about human subjects data, because that's really the type of data that requires clearance, essentially, from me as the representative of the university for all the reasons we've already talked about. We want to do ethical research, and we also want to do it in a way that's productive. So one of the things that comes up frequently is, well, do I really need to do human subjects? Do I really need to do the human subjects paperwork because I'm doing this, or because I'm doing this, or because of some subtle nuance of the work I'm doing? And I would say, couldn't hurt, right? I mean, the process of doing the paperwork, one of the things that it forces you to do is think critically about your plan. It forces you to put together documents that then get reviewed by me, your supervisor, your faculty advisor. We all give you feedback. So regardless of whether or not human subjects approval is required, the process of review, revision, resubmission means that you have the benefit of multiple people thinking through your project plan, so that we can all give you good advice about how to get the most out of your data collection. Okay. Back in 490, I gave you guys a couple of examples of different ways that human subjects data collection has been done as part of Capstone. I talked about Emma Vowles and her work doing satisfaction surveys for homeowners when they installed rain gardens. These were online surveys. I talked about Ruben Chi and his work with the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, where he was doing videotaped intern interviews in that process as well. And then we talked about Joel Kolstad, who did a combination of both observations of human behavior as well as surveys following up on those observations. So I guess I'm not going to go into the details of any of those right now, but just as a reminder, there's more than one way to collect data collection and to do data collection, and sometimes a combination of approaches is useful. Many times we've had students that have done both interviews and surveys. In some cases, one approach works and another approach doesn't work. And so thinking through the process is pretty important. I can give you feedback on that. Your site supervisor certainly can give you feedback about what's feasible. As an example, already this quarter, not to name names, but a student had planned on doing surveys, and then after talking with their site supervisor, realized that surveys probably weren't going to be a feasible option for them, so they can change course and come up with a different plan. All right, so we'll talk about surveys, we'll talk about interviews. A kind of I guess, a splinter off of interviews might be what we call a focus group. We can talk a little bit more about what that entails as well for anyone who's interested. The other thing, of course, are observations, like I said, of human behavior. If you're thinking about doing observations of human behavior, I'm happy to talk through what kinds of paperwork we would need, but usually observations of human behavior really just include coming up with a protocol summary statement of like, telling me what your plan is, and then we need to develop a data sheet that you would use, usually some sort of tabular data sheet that would allow you to keep track of the observations that you're making. So I won't go into too much detail about that right now. But I will speak a bit more about interviews and surveys. Interviews and surveys, both really common for students to do, and they can be extremely informative. The major difference, I would say, is that usually I recommend interviews for students when they want to speak to a relatively small, well-defined group of individuals, typically folks with expertise. So you're going into an internship where you have limited knowledge and expertise of a topic. And so frequently speaking with experts is a great way for you to immerse yourself in that topic and gain a lot of insight by speaking to, as I said, a relatively small number of individuals. Surveys, on the other hand, are great if you want to get the general public or a large population's input on their perceptions or their opinions on a topic. All right, so let's talk through what I see as sort of the things that you need to have if you're going to do interviews, because I'm sure that several folks on this call are thinking about doing interviews. Thumbs up if you're thinking about doing interviews. I'm just kind of curious. Lots of thumbs up. I'm seeing 9, 10. So roughly, yeah, okay, 12, 13. Wow. So a little bit over half of the folks who are on this call. Good. All right. So let's talk through the things that you need to assemble, the documents that you need to assemble in order to get human subjects approval. First is the protocol summary statement. Here is a template protocol summary statement that lays out roughly what you need to tell me about your data collection plan. So in this case, qualitative study to investigate the perspectives of a particular group of individuals on the issue, on a particular issue, right? That's usually what the summary protocol statement starts with. I would recommend, of course, talking with your site supervisor and faculty advisor on how to identify the interview subjects with a particular type of expertise, in this case, an expertise in blank. And then also how you would collect their contact information, because obviously you need to be able to contact these people as well. This goes through how you'll use your recruitment script, how you'll coordinate to set up the interviews, how you will provide them with a list of interview questions in advance, which is usually a good idea. And then what you'll do when you start the interview. We'll talk about the interview consent script, and then we'll talk about also a consent to record, which I think is a really important piece of doing effective interviews. And I'll tell you why in a minute or so. And then also what you're going to do with the data. And I included a link here for a very quick and dirty overview on how to do thematic analysis. Because when you're doing interviews, really the best way to analyze those interviews is to do what we call thematic analysis, which is basically, just in sort of cursory terms, looking at all the information you've collected, all the conversations you've had, and looking for some sort of pattern in those conversations? What sorts of themes did your interviewees talk about? Okay, so this lays out the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how of your interview. Okay, I look at this helps me to get a sense for how well articulated your plan is and what sorts of things we need to think about, what sorts of biases we might need to overcome, and so on. But this is a good template, and I will provide it to you as well, and you can just tweak it as needed. Okay. The next thing is the recruitment script. How will you reach out to people and get them to agree to participate in your interviews? Well, with interviews, I mean, most of us, especially in this weird COVID-y world we're living in, the way you're going to recruit folks to participate in your interviews is you're going to send them an email message. You might try calling them on the phone, that works too, but most of us will be sending emails. If you're going to do this by phone, it's just a matter of tweaking the script so that it doesn't sound like a robot is reading an email. But basically, and I've highlighted things that I think are the most important pieces, right? When you come up with a recruitment script, obviously you have a salutation in this case because it's an email, but you're going to indicate who you are and what your affiliation is, and then what you're working on, and why you've contacted them. In this case, you're writing to ask them to participate in an interview. The additional and really key important pieces that you need to tell them are that that this is a voluntary interview, that it's confidential. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about what the difference is between confidential and anonymous, but basically, in a nutshell, confidential means that you know who the person is, but you're not going to share their identity with others. Anonymous means that you don't know the identity of the individual, and so you couldn't share that information with others. And that's a pretty fundamental thing to think about, because when you're interviewing folks, it's almost impossible to keep that anonymous, right? Because you know who it is you're talking to. You're asking them questions. Unless it's like they're part of the witness protection program and they're disguising their voice and whatever, it's not really feasible to keep that anonymous. Also, with a small group of experts that you're asking detailed questions, quite honestly, it's pretty difficult for their identity to not be known at all. So that's just what when you're doing interviews, confidential is pretty much the target. You should also indicate how long you think the interview will take. Usually 30 minutes to 60 minutes is a rough time interval. I like to try to keep the interview a little bit shorter, more like 30 to 40 minutes. And then also you should think about sending them a list of questions in advance. It's just good etiquette. All right. So this is, again, a good template that you might want to share, or you might want to take a look at and just revise and use for your own purposes. All right, so that's the recruitment script. Now, the way this would work is you would send off this email, and then there'd be some back and forth for scheduling, and then you'd get them on your calendar, and then you'd wait for the day of the interview, and then you would contact them and you'd have your interview. The next thing you need is the interview consent. Now, obviously, when you get on the phone with someone or you get on the Zoom with someone, you're not just going to launch into a bunch of questions, right? There's pleasantries, there's a little bit of an overview of what you guys are trying to achieve, and particularly in a situation where you maybe set up the interview weeks prior, you want to refamiliarize them with the purpose of your meeting. So again, who you are, your affiliation. You want to make sure that you remind them that this is a confidential, voluntary interview. I also don't think it's a bad idea to let them know that they can skip any question they don't want to answer. But of course, you've already sent them the questions, and so they probably have a good sense of what those questions will be. And if they have any issues with them, they likely have already told you. You also want to remind them how long the interview will take. And then you want to ask them if they have any questions at this time, right? So give them a chance to ask you questions, like if they want to clarify anything about your project. Last but not least, you want to let them know that you'd like to make an audio recording of the interview for your note-taking purposes. And so this little bit of text here, I would like to make an audio recording of the interview and to aid in note-taking. I will destroy the recording at the end of my project once I've transcribed pertinent details. Is this acceptable to you? Most of the time people say yes. I will tell you that having an audio recording is infinitely better than trying to take notes during an interview. It's almost impossible to take thorough notes, particularly because you don't always know in advance what the most important pieces of information are going to be. Sometimes patterns only reveal themselves after you've had multiple interviews and you start to notice themes that are emerging from those interviews, right? So understanding themes, it's good to have the recordings. Also, to really get the precise wording of quotes, it's good to have the audio recording. So I would strongly encourage you to make every effort to record the interviews. Okay, so that's the next piece. So we've talked about the protocol summary statement. We've talked about the recruitment script. We've talked about this interview consent. And last but not least is the interview guide itself. This is the list of questions that you will prepare and that you'll provide, hopefully in advance, to your subjects. Usually the first question is sort of a getting started question, a little bit of a softball. Maybe you ask them about their familiarity with the topic, or you might ask them to describe their role at the organization and how it relates to your particular subject, that sort of thing. Then you get into your content questions, and there may be multiple content questions, some of which might have built-in follow-up or sub-questions. You really want to try to limit the total list to somewhere between 10 to 15, and a shorter list is usually better. I mean, you think about it, 30 minutes can go by pretty fast, especially with folks who like to talk. Generally, though, the last two questions that everyone should have are questions like this. Is there anything we haven't discussed today that you think would be important for me to know? Because you're not the expert, and you've asked them questions, but maybe they have something else that they feel is important that they want to share. So you want to give them the opportunity to tell you that. And then the last thing is, and then, I think this is an important question. It may not be entirely relevant to your topic, but are there other people you think I should talk to about this topic? Maybe you don't have the most extensive list or the complete list of all of the experts on the topic, whereas this person, your participants might have ideas of who you can talk to. All right, so that's interviews in a nutshell. Those are the things that you need to put together for me for approval. Okay. All right, well, I'm assuming that if about half the group, a little over half the group wants to do interviews, the other half of you are thinking about doing things like surveys. So I'm going to just very quickly talk through what is involved in surveys. Surveys are good for broader participation. I would imagine that most, if not all of you are doing, or who would be doing surveys, will be doing online surveys, again, because we live in these weird COVID times. So let's talk about what that entails. Some of it is very similar to what I just shared with you for the interview structure. So there's a survey protocol statement, which in many ways has much the same type of information included, and I'll share this template with you. There are a couple of other things that may be useful or necessary to think about here. One of the things that I will say about survey protocol statements is that that first of all, that the surveys are anonymous, but also in addition, there's a slightly different ways to analyze those surveys. There may be some short answer questions that you would analyze in more of a thematic style, but a lot of the questions, because of their structure, are going to be easier to tabulate, right? Because if they're true, false, or if they're multiple choice, you can just look at the percentage of responses in different categories. So that part can be a little bit simpler. All right, so you have your protocol summary statement. The next piece is the recruitment script. And most of you will either be recruiting your survey respondents through an email, which might be blasted out over a listserv, or it might be structured in as a social media post or as a blog post that might be posted in a neighborhood blog or over Nextdoor or put on a Facebook page or sent out over Twitter or put on maybe an Instagram or something like that. There's lots of different ways that you can do it. But basically, again, you want to indicate who you are and your affiliation and why you're contacting them, why you're reaching out. And then you want to indicate that the survey is voluntary, that it's anonymous. In this case, you're not collecting personal information, identifying information about the person, and how long the survey will take, and generally how many questions you will ask. And that's a really important thing to consider, because just tell you from my experience as someone who's put together a lot of surveys and helped students with a lot of surveys, if you have a survey that takes longer than about 5 minutes to complete, you're not going to get a lot of responses, or you're going to have a lot of people who will just refuse to participate. 5 minutes doesn't seem like much time, but honestly, people think they're busy and that 5 minutes is worth a lot to them. And so unless you're offering some sort of incentive, or unless they know you, or unless they have some sort of additional skin in the game, 5 minutes is about as much as they're willing to provide for free. So if you're going to put together a survey, 5 minutes, roughly 10 to 15 questions max, is about all you can expect. Okay, so obviously you want to let them know that if you want to have something on there that allows them to contact you if they have questions about the survey, and then usually a URL that links to the survey itself. And that's about it. So you want to you really do want to try to keep it short and sweet and to the point, because a lot of people won't read through a longer message, but that's the basics of what you need to include. All right, so that's the recruitment script. And then I put on here as sort of a special or sort of a side note, there should be a survey preface, but this is actually sort of built into the survey itself. It's usually something at the top of the survey that that thanks people for agreeing to take the survey and reminds them of what the purpose of the survey is, that it's voluntary, anonymous, and how long it's going to take, and that they can skip questions. The reason that we repeat this information is, especially with an online survey, it's possible that a person could reach your survey without having seen your recruitment script. So imagine that I send this to somebody, and then that person copies the URL and sends it on to their friends or sends it on to somebody else. So it's possible for someone to actually get to your survey without actually seeing your recruitment script. So you want to try to summarize it at the beginning of the survey. Okay, so that's the survey preface. Very short, sweet, to the point. And again, you can take this template and modify it as needed. Then there's the survey instrument itself. And unlike the interview guide, survey instruments require a lot more time and attention, because you really want to come up with good, solid questions that are easy to understand and very easy to analyze. And so different types of questions would be like multiple choice questions or Likert scale questions, things like strongly agree to strongly disagree, or very familiar to completely unfamiliar, or very interested to completely disinterested. You can use short answer, but use them sparingly because they take more time to respond to. And again, you're trying to keep this to like 5 minutes. But then the last piece, and a very important piece of a survey, I mentioned that you don't want to have any more than 10 to 15 questions. You do want to make sure that at least a small number of those questions are what we call demographic questions. Demographic questions allow you to interpret the responses to what we call our content questions. So in the case of, oh gosh, let's say, well, let's think back to Emma Vowell's survey that she did of rain garden participants, or people who have installed rain gardens. Okay, sure, you're gonna have, you might have 5, 6, 7, 8 questions specifically about rain gardens, right? But in order to interpret the responses that you might get to those questions, you should have demographics questions that ask about the respondents' age, gender identity, race, ethnicity, income, education, because those things allow us to interpret patterns. So here, for instance, as an example, maybe we asked somebody about rain gardens, right? And it turns out, the question is, was installing a rain garden a good investment for you? Strongly agree to strongly disagree. Okay, half the group strongly agrees, half the group strongly disagrees. Why would that happen? Why would you end up with such a diversity of responses? Well, you can dig deeper into those questions and relate them to the demographics questions. And heck, maybe you find out that those people who think that it was a good investment are folks who have a higher income on average than the people who think it's a bad investment. So you understand these demographic questions allow us to interpret the responses to the other content-driven questions. And so they are pretty important. And again, because the survey is an anonymous data collection approach, you have no idea what the person who responded looks like, what they think like, what their background is, what their experience is, unless they share that information through the demographics. Okay, so that's the survey instrument. And I just want to point out that I have put together a template survey on Catalyst Tools. It's a UW tool. So there's different ways you can do online surveys. You can use Google Forms, you can use SurveyMonkey. I like Catalyst because it's a UW tool. You all have access to it for free. And I put together a template, and I've already shared that with all of you. If you log into Catalyst, you'll see that there's a tool that's available to you called Capstone Research Survey Template. All you need to do is make a copy of that template, rename it, whatever you want to call it, and then start editing the content. And you'll see that there, here's the survey preface that you'll want to tweak. Then, here's an example of a multiple choice question. Here's an example of a Likert scale from very familiar to unfamiliar. Here's one about how often a person does something: always, often, sometimes, rarely, never. And then there's also a set of example demographics questions: age in various bin sizes, gender identity, education level, gross income, those sorts of things. All right, like I said, this template survey, which can be modified, is on Catalyst, and you all have access to it now as students in the 491 course. Last thing that I will say to y'all is that this is the first step, right? You put together the documents. The approval process goes a little something like this. You put together the documents and you send them to me as a Word, in probably Word or word processing type form. It's important that I be able to edit them, right? Don't send them as PDFs. That makes it more challenging for me to give you feedback. So send me all the documents in Word or similar, including the survey. You can, if you send me the survey in Word, then you can translate that into Catalyst. You have to remember that you have to share it with me. You also have to share it with your site supervisor and faculty advisor. We got to give you feedback. So we'll start here. I'll give you feedback. I'll review it. I'll edit the documents, send them back to you. You'll revise. And then once you revise, if it all looks good, if the edits are relatively minor, then you will send those materials around to me. Your site supervisor and your faculty advisor will give you additional feedback and approval. And then once you have approval from everyone, you can begin doing your work, whether it's surveys or interviews or observations of human behavior. We really do want you to go through this entire process before you start in on your work. And the reason for that is manifold, really, multiple reasons. Primarily, obviously, we want to make sure that everything is done by the book because the university has these restrictions and guidelines, but also because we want you to have a successful time doing data collection, right? And if you launch into doing, spending a lot of time on interviews, a lot of time on surveys, and it turns out that maybe the questions weren't worded correctly or didn't really get to the crux of your research um, needs, then that's time that's kind of wasted. And it's not just your time that's wasted. Think about like all of the interviews, right? I mean, the people who sat down with you to do the interviews, that's wasted time on their part. If you just sum up the multiple people who complete a survey, each person spends 5 minutes, you get a couple hundred people filling out a survey. That's a lot of minutes that are wasted. I digress. But that's the approval process. And I encourage you all to, to get started on these things relatively quickly, because, the more people who turn in all their documents to me at the same time, the slower my response will be, because I'll have to get through it all. Right? There'll be sort of a bottleneck. I would like everyone to get their documents approved so that you have a lot of time during the quarter to complete your data collection. In the case of interviews, the process of scheduling interviews, of conducting interviews, and then analyzing interviews is incredibly time consuming. And so you want to make sure that you allow lots of time to do, to do that, to undertake that process. One thing I think is very, very critical for you all to understand is that we don't really have time in 492 to do the analysis on human subjects work, right? So basically you are doing the data collection, and you at least need to do some preliminary analysis of your human subjects data before you get into 492, because once we hit 492, boom, we just got to just dive right in to the synthesis of that information and the communication of that information. So you have roughly 9-10 weeks to get this entire thing done. So the sooner you get started, the better. Okay, so questions, y'all. Let's go ahead and get into the questions from folks. I am going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just stop sharing, and I'm also going to stop recording so that we can get into just more of the individual questions that many of you likely have. So let's stop recording.